Amen. Brilliant. Well, by the time we get to chapter 28, I want you to think about the distances that have been covered. Okay? So, by the time we get to the end of chapter 28 of the book of Acts, remember we started in Jerusalem in the very first verse of chapter 1 with 120 believers. By the end of the book of Acts, in a mere short 35 years, the gospel has gone something round about 2,950 miles, which back in the day they didn't have air flight, but if they did have air flight, that's an 8-hour plane flight to get there. And rather than 120 people, we're talking tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people have trusted Jesus as Lord. We are talking about the single most single movement, social movement that has had the biggest impact across all of history. And that was just in 35 years. And what marked this one out was not that it was a big mass movement of faith and change, but it was the borders that it crossed. So sometimes you'd have people who would... there would be a big development of religion in a particular area, but it wouldn't go across ethnic and political lines and across socio-economic lines. All kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds in all kinds of countries were naming Jesus Christ as Lord. But it wasn't without difficulty. And as we've seen, we've been moving through this book of Acts, and as we've seen, we're at that point where the Apostle Paul, he's been in prison for 5 chapters. 5 trials across 5 chapters at the hands of governors and kings. And in fact, when we think back to Acts chapter 9 and we saw the first day that Paul became, he was Saul, he became Paul, he was arrested by Jesus, as we'll hear about in a minute, and he was told that he would testify to the truth of Jesus Christ as the Lord of all history, the resurrected Lord, in front of kings and governors and authorities. And guess what he's doing? Exactly what it says on the tin. We should be really confident in this book. But the place where I want to start for today as we look at these chapters is you. Okay? And the reason I want to start with you is because the book of Acts was written so that real people like you and me would be delighting in the prospect of having Jesus as our Lord and Saviour, and would have a sense of confidence to take that gospel to anybody, no matter what the cost, no matter what the difficulty, no matter how long the wait. So here's where I'm going to start with you. What do you dream about? When you've got that little bit of moment of quiet, what do you think will bring you blessing? Now, I don't know about you, but this one changes. I was working this out today. This one changes for me almost every day of the week. I seem to have limitless ability to be able to picture the good life. To be able to picture, if I have that, then I am blessed. That is the thing that I want for me. That is the thing I want for my kids. That is the thing I want for my friends. That is the thing that I will talk about because it energizes my heart and soul. What do you dream about? I mean, we're a society, aren't we, where we have desires and vision pushed on us every day. We're taught to be dissatisfied so that we'll spend money. We're told we have big glossy pictures put up in front of us to say, if you are like this person or if you have this thing, then life will be found in all its fullness. I think it's one of the big temptations of social media, isn't it? You just start scanning through and just looking at what's in everybody else's life, and what's one of the chief feelings most of the time. Occasionally you're like, oh, I'm so glad I'm not that person. But if there's somebody who's showing something that's vaguely a good thing, you're not sitting there going, well, I don't want that in my life. You're like, I want that in my life. And that's what it's really difficult for some of you teenagers, isn't it? With all the social media. Everybody's saying, have this or pursue this or go after this. And you're like, oh, don't like. So for me on Monday, what was it for me? What was the good life? Well, I'd put on a few pounds because I'd been away. Working, as I said last week, doing some work on the property in Spain, and I put on a few pounds, so all I could think about that day was if I just lose a few pounds, life will be worth living. Of course, it takes more than a few days. Tuesday, I saw a clip on telly. I think it was George Clooney, and he was being interviewed on one of these American talk shows, and that was where my heart went, because there was the talk show host fawning over George Clooney. There was all the audience just wanting to hear his every last word. And what was it my heart was drawn towards? Wouldn't the good life be just having everybody love you? I mean, obviously you love me and you hang on my every word week by week, don't you? But that was something, that's where life is. Life is having everybody think you are awesome. And so Tuesday, that was where my heart went. Okay, Wednesday I was out for a bike ride and I was looking at how fast I was going according to my little computer, and it was really, really bad. So Wednesdays, do you know, if I can knock 2 minutes off my 10-mile time, achievement, that is where life is. And that was what I daydreamed about on Wednesday. So you're getting all into my psychosis here. Thursday, me and Anthony, we had an away day, and we were envisioning where we would like the church to be and everything like that. And I suppose, well, what was that one? That was sort of a sense of, yes, success. The Lord wants us to move forward and build the church and do this. And that was what was buzzing around my heart. That's the good life, that is. And then on Friday, me and Jay, it was my day off, had some time with the missus. We went out on the tandem and we pedalled around Sefton Park, and the flowers smelt great. I say we weren't on the tandem, we were on 2 separate bikes, which was, I had to push Jane, so that wasn't great. But we were out on 2 separate bikes around Sefton Park, and there was sun, and there was other people who were jogging and feeling happy, and it was, the good life. The good life. I wonder what it was for you. Was it for watching a movie and there was just like the action hero was there and it's like, yes, that is what it means to be alive. Or maybe it was that romantic comedy where the girl finally gets the guy who really knows how troubled and broken she is, but he loves her anyway and will do anything and be at her beck and call. Was it that? We are in a world where we're taught to think, and we love it, we give ourselves to it, we dream of what the best life could possibly be. It's intoxicating, isn't it? It's alluring. You do it every day. You picture the best conceivable future for yourself. And quite often you flip day by day. Sometimes it's just without that bit of trouble, without that bit of junk, or without that thing that happened to me or I did not, that seems to be hanging over me. And I find ways to try and build my way out of that. Let's meet the Apostle Paul. Let's meet the Apostle Paul as he's been doing this gospel outreach, and he is sticking out like a sore thumb. Look at him in chapter 26, verse 28 and 29. Look at where he is and look at what he says. So the king that has been listening to Paul witter on about Jesus says, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" And notice what Paul replies. But think for a second, where is Paul? He's in prison garb. He's been under house arrest for the last 2 years. He's up against this massive big court, the sort of the pomp and the ceremony, the highest opulence that the world has to show off. This is what to live for. And there's puny little Paul standing in the middle. And in the eyes of these people, he has absolutely nothing. But what does he say? Do you think... verse 29. Paul replied, "Short time or long, I pray that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am." Except for the chains. What he's doing is he's saying, I have every blessing. If you knew, Agrippa, if you knew, people listening on, the riches that are mine, you would be running down and grabbing a hold of me and saying, please, 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 please can I have what you've got? It's so wonderful. Let me in. Can I just have a half of it? You see, most people daydreamed about being Agrippa. Do you? Sometimes you find yourself being, do you know, I'd love to be a celebrity. I'd love to have more money than I've got now. You belong to Jesus. This is if you're a believer here today. You belong to Jesus, but you find yourself saying, do you know, it's all right following Jesus, but I'd really like to be George Clooney, or to be able to cycle faster, or lose more weight, or have the good life every day. Do you find yourself... Of course you do, because that's what you daydream about. And here's Paul, seemingly in the middle of nothing. He's got nothing, but he's got everything, and nobody can take it from him. Listen, I want us to leave in a second. Well, not in a second. I don't want you to leave in a second. In a little while, when it is time to leave, I want you to go out with a sense that if you have Jesus, You have something that outstrips everything just phenomenally. And more than that, because it's so precious to you, you would have the same desire as the Apostle Paul, that shaped his days and his convictions and the way he spent his time and what he was prepared to go through, i.e., what I've got, these riches, I want other people to have too. Now, I don't want to freak you out, but we've got 6 points. And I'm going to race through them, and Rachel's looking worried. I've got 6 points, and if we don't get through all of them, we won't get through them. Did we manage to pull up a slide? Dean, you're a ninja. We're going to see that the state of this is you're going to be living under one of two horizons. Okay, so Paul, he was in the same room as all those people, but there were two different worlds. There was a world that was full of fantasy, fakery, and fiction. And then Paul paints a picture of a world that is full of fact, forgiveness, and faith. We're going to see each of those in turn. So look down with me, kick back into chapter 25, look at verse 23. Somebody read verse 23 as we start and to look at the fiction. We start to look at the fiction. Somebody read that out for us nice and loud, please. Just verse 23. I'm clearly not adored like George Clooney. Stuart, thank you very much for reading that. Okay, so let me just bring you up to speed from where we were last week. So Paul was arrested in Jerusalem because of a plot to get him. The Roman soldiers had to rescue him from the crowd because they just wanted to kill him because they hate him because he stood for Jesus. Then in the end, Paul was able to get a defense because he was a Roman citizen. Felix, who was the governor then, was a bit of a shady character. We haven't got time to talk about him. Go and read about him in chapter 24. Not a very nice guy, but he kept Paul under house arrest for 2 whole years. Felix was finally got rid of, which would have been a great relief to the nation because he was trashing it. And a new governor comes in from Rome called Festus. I always think of, which TV program do you think of when you hear that name? Yeah, Addams Family. If you're really young, you need to go and watch the Addams Family. Okay, you think of Festus. Didn't look like him, probably. Okay. So Festus is here. He's a Roman dignitary, but he's not that familiar with the way that the whole Jewish thing works. So he's asked a few questions of the Apostle Paul and tried to do some backhanded favours to the Jewish authorities to keep them sweet. He could have just released Paul, but he knew that if he did, he wouldn't have had as much peace and quiet from the Jewish authorities. So instead what he does is he holds him over and he beckons in the Jewish king. Now that's King Agrippa. Let me tell you about King Agrippa. King Agrippa is the son of King... Sorry, this is Agrippa II, who is the son of King Agrippa I, Herod Agrippa I, who was the one who was there on the night where Jesus was condemned at trial and then the next day sent off to the cross. So he's basically cut from the same piece of stone. He was brought up as a pagan in Rome, though he had a Jewish descent. He was very politically minded. He's here with his wife Bernice. Well, I say wife Bernice. She's actually his queen and his sister, and they're in an incestuous relationship. So this is the guy, okay. He's brought in as like a consultant. He's brought in as a consultant to Festus because, well, Festus doesn't get this Jewish thing. Agrippa's sort of Jewish. He's their man, Rome's man who knows about the Jewish thing. Come and listen to Paul and sort it all out. But what I want you to notice is the fantasy that is there. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came in with great pomp. That word pomp is where we get the word fantasy from. Do you get the idea? So it would have been all about propriety and order, and depending on how powerful and significant you are, would also affect how soon you could walk into the room, how long you had to stand for, what degree and level of clothing you could wear. So what you've got is this whole big show, a little bit like a peacock. You see this fancy little peacock thing? Well, for a second there, you got this peacock with this massive big tail feathers looking absolutely beautiful. The second that the tail feathers that are just down there, the peacock looks like a pigeon. Okay? This is the fantasy that they were living in. We are strong, we are capable. They were living the dream, and it was tempted to play along with that fantasy. It's the same fantasy that we see on social media. It's the same fantasy that is in the media. It is the same fantasy that when we go down to the retail park, have you noticed they only ever put beautiful looking people on the pictures? And you and I are like, yes, we'll go by there because it'll make me them. Okay? It'll make me them. And here they are living this fantasy. It's all full of pride, and they're standing there together. And then you've got Paul, who is brought in. And there is nothing fake about him. He's not living any kind of fantasy. So you just leave it for a second because everybody's looking that way rather than this way. We'll fix it in a minute. Don't worry about it, mate. He's not living any fantasy. He is what you see. And I love this. This is always the way that real truth comes into a life. We're so easily fooled with the outer that we miss the inner. We're so filled with the fantasy that we miss where real substance is. And that's what you would have missed if you had walked past the cross on Good Friday morning. You would have seen somebody hanging between heaven and earth with nails through his hands, bleeding, and you would have dismissed him as a waste of space and no time. But in that moment, Jesus, though he was despised by the world, was bringing in a salvation that would spread to the ends of the earth and have an impact into eternity, bringing new life to those who had no standing whatsoever. And here's this contrast here, this fantasy world versus this real world. You see it sometimes, don't you, in the Hollywood movies. I was trying to think of an example, but I just haven't watched enough teen Hollywood movies recently. So I think back to the early days of Neighbours. So some of you here, you'll remember this. Do you remember, some of you who are old enough, Plain Jane Superbrain? Does anybody remember that from Neighbours? Costas, Stewart, does anybody? Andy, I bet you used to watch Neighbours. Linda remembers it. So here was this character who clearly, she was the class dweeb, or supposed to be anyway. They gave her a really bad hairdo, no makeup, really dour clothes, the most awful NHS possible glasses that there could be. But already as the audience, you sort of suspected there was more to her. And of course, she had her coming out moment where it was a prom or something like that, and off came the glasses. She put on a half-decent dress. She'd been to have her hair done, and she was beautiful. All the way through, she'd been mocked and ridiculed. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because we love stories that show that there is more substance than quite often the fantasy. Can I tell you, where does that idea come from? It comes from Jesus. Blink and you will miss him. But there is life abounding in Jesus. Now, if you can't see the value of Jesus, it could be because you're blinded by fantasy. I struggle with that every day. Fantasy comes my way, and it looks so real and tangible. But I'm saved by Jesus. That's of more value. That would have hit the first readers of this book. They were being presented with fantasy, the glory of Greece and Rome every day. It looked so real. It seemed to offer such power. And why bother speaking about Jesus, a man who died on a cross in that situation? But he had real substance. So that's the fantasy. What about the fakery? Okay, the fakery. Somebody read for us chapter 25, verses 24 through to the end of the chapter. 24 through to the end of the chapter. Don't leave me hanging, people. Thanks, Mary. Thank you for reading that. I think what we want to see here is the fakery behind all of this. Here is somebody in a place of authority, but make no mistake of it, just like you and me, we're all in the PR consultancy business. We're all into image management. And can you see him in your mind's eye as he stands up in front of this massive big crowd? Most of them some of them will be enemies who are pretending to be friends. Some of them will be looking up at him in jealousy. And the thing that he wants to communicate to the world who is watching him is that he is in charge, he is reasonable, he is honourable, people should want to be like him. You see what he's communicating? So he models himself, doesn't he, there in verse 24, as the guardian of justice. I am so even-handed, fair-minded, I will ensure that justice is done. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm a reasonable man, verse 25. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he had made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome, which interestingly he didn't have to do. If he knew there was no charge, he could have released him. He shows his manoeuvring in verse 25, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. That's manoeuvring, because if he didn't need to send him to Rome, the only reason he's doing that is to get rid of this Jewish problem. Because if he keeps Paul locked up, he doesn't do justice, but he keeps the Jewish people happy. So I know, but if he lets Paul go, he's going to have a Jewish problem, but will have done the wrong thing. I know what I'll do is I'll manoeuvre the whole thing on, and I'll pass Paul on so he's the emperor's problem, not mine. I can get on and do my job with peace and quiet. He's shallow, verse 26. Look at this. But I have nothing definitive to write to his majesty about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa. It's just flattery. For I think it is unreasonable to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. Here is a guy who's standing up and pretending to be so much more noble than he really is. And what should shock us here is how people, sometimes quite often people of power, can be so self-deluded. They can believe the hype about themselves. They can build a plausible lie when actually they're just playing a part and pretending. Institutions, organisations, and of course if an institution and organisation can do it, so can an individual. This is something that is in the heart of everybody. We're all into image management. We all know how to communicate a fake version of ourselves, which would be fine if there isn't a God who really knows and is near. But there is a God who is really knows and is near. There is only one who is wise and discerns men's heart. There is only one who is just and can say what needs to be done. Please take notice of this. You may have all the world has, but if you don't have him, the one who is wise, the one who is just, the one who is reasonable, then the likelihood is you will be kidding yourself, and to some degree or another living in fakery. And here is Festus as a picture of that, of a picture of what Jesus, the world that Jesus sends his gospel message into, will be like. And it gives a little bit of an echo of what we might be like as well. I wonder whether there's a chance that there's ways in which we've been communicating ourselves to others or to ourselves in a way that means that we've been fake. He sees straight through it, just as we can see straight through Festus and Agrippa here. Next up, we've seen fantasy, fakery, now the fiction. Okay, somebody read for us verses 1 through to 12 of chapter 26. 1 through to 12 of chapter 26. Just leave it there. That's absolutely great. Thank you. Okay, so I say fiction here. Paul's about to be honest and say he lived a fiction for a while. The honesty here is absolutely great. He's very respectful to King Agrippa. He's delighted that here's somebody who will have a feel for the Jewish history, the Jewish scriptures. But Paul is basically going to say, you guys, you're living in total ignorance, and I sat there too. You're living a fictitious story. You're living a fiction, and I sat where you did once. And he does it with great humility because he doesn't think he's superior or better than them. He's deeply respectful. If anything, he's looking out on this crowd of people who view him as an enemy, and he's not speaking as if I've arrived. In a minute, we're going to see that he's speaking as somebody who had an intervention brought into his life, and he wants that intervention for all of them. His history and his story come out there in the first few verses about how religious he was according to the sect of the Jews. He'd lived for that. But he's honest enough there to say in verses 6 to 8 that he had sat on a promise and not even realised it was there. He'd sat on a promise and not even realised it was there. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I am on trial today. There was this hope he'd sat on. He'd be quietest. He didn't even realise it was there. Verse 7, this is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. O King, it is because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. So here he's seeing that Christian faith is the continuation of the Jewish hope. The fulfillment of the promises made to Israel have come true in Jesus, but the Jewish nation have been sitting on it and not even realised it was there. You see, if the current Jewish leaders and the Romans were pursuing a fantasy through fakery and fiction, it's because they've got a great discovery to make. I need to say as a little sidebar here, the Christian gospel is good news because it's all full of hope. So what do I mean by this? The gospel proclaims not that you're going to hell, but that if you are going to hell, it is because you have actively sidestepped the way out that has been provided, the hope of Jesus. The gospel isn't a drive-by guilting, but actually comes to us and says, there's one who can eradicate your guilt. There is hope. And we've been sitting on this and we've missed this. There's a true story, not the fakery and the fantasy story, not the fiction. There's a real story of planet Earth. The gospel isn't to lose your life, but to gain new life in Jesus. Hope out of the fantasy, the fiction, the fakery. That's what I was missing. There's a hope there that I hadn't seen, a real answer to life after death, a resurrection hope, the greatest and scariest of all enemies, but I sat on this hope, I didn't see it. In fact, anybody who started to talk about this hope, I would try to destroy. Verse 9. I too was convinced that I ought to do all that was possible to oppose the name of Jesus. I hadn't got a clue as to how much power there was in that name, of the significance of who he is. And I wonder whether he was saying that with tears in his eyes as he stood in front of them that day. And that is just what I did in Jerusalem. On the authority of the chief priests, I put many of the saints in prison, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. He was a religious terrorist, a fundamentalist nutter. He's not coming from a place of, I've arrived. He's coming a place of, this is terrible. I sat on this hope, and I didn't realise it was there, and I didn't see it. I lived a fiction. Many a time I went from one synagogue to another to have them punished, and I tried to force them to blaspheme. I tried to get them to denounce the name of Jesus. In my obsession against them, I was absolutely determined. I was highly committed to my way of making my world work and living out that fiction. And all the time I sat on this great truth. I was where you lot are. But then something changed. Point 4, fact. Somebody read for us verses 12 through to 14. Brilliant, thank you. Now, please, this might be a shock to you, but this isn't a story of how suddenly somebody found the key to life and a set of steps and principles to follow, and suddenly his life all came together. Now, I know that is what we're encouraged to do. So in UK at the moment, the way in which you find any hope for the future is you find the few keys that you're missing, apply them to your life, and life will get better. This wasn't what happened. It wasn't that he found life, it was that life came in and found him. And life wasn't a principle, life was a person. You heard it right there. An event happened. There was a dramatic intervention. Now, by the way, I just need to say, if you're seriously going to try to dismiss the Christian faith, you've got to be really serious about dismissing the conversion of the Apostle Paul. One of the most dramatic turnarounds. Here was this terrorist murderer who hated Christians. What would have happened to him that was powerful enough to mean that now he's prepared to lay down his life to see the name of Jesus go to all the nations? This is a powerful, persuasive force for the authenticity, the reality of the Christian message of Jesus Christ as the present living Lord. About noon, O King, I was on the road. I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. That is a fact. He's not making up some sort of religious dogma. He's saying this is what happened. Rock solid fact. A spiritual life that was real, objective, full of truth, exploded into my experience. He was the one I'd heard about but tried to dismiss. He was the hope that I'd been sitting on in the pursuit of my own agenda. But here he stopped me in my tracks. He knocked me off the horse, the path I was on, in order that I could be put back on one that was true, that wasn't fantasy fakery or fiction. Here is the one who meets real people. I'd been kicking against the goads. You know, goads are those things that we should all have for children. They're those spiky things that you put round animals that if they try to sort of not go where you want them to do, it's ow, ow. So I'm all for that, you know, sort of dark ages when looking after the kids. Some sort of goad. Jesus was pushing him to an inevitable conclusion about what was true and right in life. That there is one God, that he is Lord, that we have sinned, and that there is salvation for all who come to Jesus. But he was kicking against it, and the result was him persecuting Jesus' people. And here Jesus comes in bringing spiritual life and says, I'm going to convert you. I'm going to change you around. And as Paul looked out on that big crowd, guess what he wanted for them? He wanted them to put off their fantasy, their fakery, and their fiction. He wanted them, as he did in every group of people that he went to, he wanted them to know this Jesus. What about forgiveness? What did it bring in? Somebody read for us from verse 15 down to verse 18 for us, please. Brilliant. Thank you for reading that. Now, this is what you get now. Some of you sitting there going, right, I really need to know that I've got more than George Clooney, or I've got more that is being advertised on social media. And this is the bit, okay. All of what we're about to say can never be taken from you and has got a cash value from now into all eternity. So what happens here? What is it that when you become like Paul, verse 29, what is it that has happened to him that is the possession of everybody who chooses to surrender to Jesus? Well, number one, you get a personal encounter with the true and living God. Look, it's personal. Jesus is not a power off beyond the Andromeda galaxy. There is a living God who comes near to you, who knows your name, he knows your passwords, he knows what you do, he knows the worst about you, and he comes to you and says, I want you. We've got that today, church, if we're followers of Jesus. Now, that's something to get excited about when you're being lured towards other things to get excited about in the week. Next up, stand up. For the first time, verse 16, now get up and stand on your feet. Here he is given standing in the true and real world for the first time ever. He understands for the first time ever what it really means to be human, which is to have a relationship to Jesus. He is given a standing before the King. Next up, he's appointed. He's given a task. And way back, do you remember way back in September when we started this series? We said that you are either a missionary or a mission field. Now that isn't just true for the Apostle Paul. It's true for you and me too. So which one are you this morning? Are you a missionary called and appointed by Jesus to be pursuing his agenda for this world, being used by him to reach new people, to bring this message of new life to them? Or are you a mission field? You've got to be one or the other. You've got to be one or the other. Are you somebody who's yet to be reached? The second you are reached, you are appointed and on task. You have a meaning and a purpose. And it isn't to be able to ride faster, to be able to lose more weight, or to be loved and adored by other people. At the end of your life, you won't go, I wish I'd lost a few more pounds. When you meet Jesus, you won't say, if only I could pedal faster. You won't say that. When you meet Jesus and see him in all his splendor, you will simply say, whoa, you're worth more than I thought you were. I wish I'd told more people. Light comes in. Did you see that? Verse 18. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. This is what the Lord said to Paul. I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light. That's what Jesus does. This is what you've got. You've got light, spiritual light. You don't have to hide in the dark. You don't have to be clueless about what life is about. You have the light of Jesus come in. And from the power of Satan to God, deliverance, liberation from the lies of Satan that have been flattening life in this world since the very beginning. You have forgiveness so that they may receive forgiveness of sins. Guilt can be put behind you. Oh, we may still fail, but guilt isn't what gets written over us, and we're not treated by Jesus on the basis of our performance, but on the basis of the merit of his. Our guilt is put away so that we can stand tall in the presence of God without fear. And then you get a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. The thing that went wrong in the world was that we got alienated from God, from each other and ourselves. And here we get a place back amongst the people. So as Paul first got that when he became a believer, as he's offering that out to these crowds that are surrounding him, I think he's trying to say, those are the things that will define me. I don't know about you, but there's loads of things that I want or think of and like to be known as or feel sense of security. I'm Steve, I'm the dad of 6 daughters, which makes me a bit weird and a bit special. Okay? That's nice. But actually, the biggest thing about me is that I'm a forgiven sinner. Steve, I do certain activities and I preach sermons and I talk to people about Jesus, but the biggest thing about me is I'm a forgiven sinner. That is the big thing. If I have absolutely everything in the world but don't have this, then I'm cursed. If I have nothing in the world but have this, then I'm more blessed than I can possibly imagine. And if that's the case and that starts to sink in, that'll change the things that I want to talk to people around me about. It'll change me on a Tuesday night when I've got to turn up and do a Speak Kids story and I just can't be bothered. It'll change me when it comes to figuring out my budget and what I give my money to. It'll change me when I'm feeling as if I shouldn't be suffering and struggling like this because I belong to Jesus. And they go, oh, but he's promised me a way out of this shadow lands into the glory lands. If you don't have Jesus but have every part of your fantasy, you are cursed. And so finally, we see faith. And this is where it pushes to. I'll read this last bit. Verse 24. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. You are out of your mind, Paul, he shouted. Your great learning is driving you insane. Don't be surprised if you're living for this big story of Jesus that other people think you're nuts. Because they're still living under the fantasy, the fiction, and the fakery that this world is anything other than a world belonging to the Lord in whom we're supposed to know him. You're bonkers. You've lost your mind, laddie. You are nuts. You're cuckoo. You're gone. He doesn't want to know. And then Paul turns to Festus. What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? Now, I love this. If you really are excited about somebody getting it, you answer the question that you've just given them for them. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. It's make your mind up time. Where are you going to stand today? Will you put your faith in Jesus, or will you pursue this sham of a life? And Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? What's he doing there? He's saying really loudly, this is too close, this is too personal, this is too near. Back off. Step back. And Paul replied, because he's used to immediately coming back with something important, I pray that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am. Have what I have through faith in Jesus. Have the fact, have the forgiveness, have the faith. I'd love to have seen the look on his face as the king rose with him, the governor and Bernice, and those sitting with them. They left the room. They walked out. And as those first believers who got this letter would have seen this, and when they would have seen the Apostle Paul just saying, we've got everything, they would have read this letter and said, yes, we have got so much more than those people in power, and we have got so much more of a reason to speak. So I'm hoping, I'm going to be singing, I'm assuming, are we singing in a second, Anthony? I'm hoping that as you sing, you will have that same sense too. The delight that you don't have to live in fantasy, fakery, fiction, but you've got fact, forgiveness and faith by joining yourself to Jesus and being on mission for him to the ends of the earth. Let's stand together and sing.